Filipino psychology or Psikolohiyang Pilipino. Psikolohiyang Pilipino or Filipino psychology refers to the psychology born out of the experience, thoughts, and orientation of the Filipinos based on the full use of the Filipino culture and language. This disenchantment continued as Filipinos struggled to assert their national and cultural identity. So, Filipino psychology or Psikolohiyang Filipino is defined as psychology rooted through the experience, ideas, and cultural orientation of the Filipinos. It was formalized in 1975 by the Pambansang Samahan sa Psikolohiyang Pilipino or the National Association for Filipino Psychology under the leadership of Virgilio Enriquez, who is regarded by many as the father of the Filipino psychology. So Virgilio Gaspar Enriquez, he was a Filipino psychologist considered the father of Psikolohiyang Filipino or the Filipino psychology, who advanced indigenous psychology in the Philippines, born in Bulacan on November 24, 1942. He was the youngest child of Arsenio Enriquez and Rosario Gaspar. So the history of the Filipino psychology. Filipino psychology emerged and grew as a part of the national indigenization movement in the Philippines that was formalized in 1975. The roots of the Filipino psychology can be traced back to the introduction of the American education system in the Philippines. Agustin Alonso was among the first Filipino psychologists to return from their education in America in 1925 to teach at the College of Education in the University of the Philippines. This team brought with them psychological knowledge rooted in the American tradition of psychology. Western psychology is taught in school as the universal and scientific, despite being generally considered by some as insensitive and inappropriate to Philippine culture. This hegemony of the Western American psychology is referred to as colonial psychology. During in the 1960s, many Filipino intellectuals and scholars were already aware of the limitation and incapability of the Western psychology. Western-oriented approach in research in particular had led scholars to paint Filipino through the judgmental and impressionistic views of the colonizers. It is with the use of American categories and standards that the native Filipino invariably suffer from the comparison in not too subtle attempts to put forward Western behavior patterns as models for the Filipinos. Early efforts to correct the traditional way of teaching and studying psychology in 1960s include the translation of the foreign materials and the use of the Filipino language as the mode of instruction. However, these efforts failed to address the problems brought about by the colonial psychology, as these efforts were sparse and not collaborated upon by the psychologists. It was only in the 1970s that concerted efforts to address colonial psychology in the form of Filipino psychology took place. Filipino psychology, along with the advances in Filipinology and similarly histories Pantayong Pananaw, was led by Virgilio Enriquez, Prospero Covar, and Zeus A. Salazar in the indigenization movement of their respective fields. Enriquez returned from his studies to the Philippines in 1971 and established the Philippine Psychology Research House, or now the Philippine Psychology Research and Training House, or the PPRTH. In 1975, the very first annual National Conference of the Filipino Psychology was held by the Pambansang Samahan sa Psikolohiyang Filipino or the PSSP. marking the formalization of the Filipino psychology. So that's all for today's video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something about the Filipino psychology and its history.